Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're setting out to uncover something quite profound: the origins of an American family, tracing their story back over 3 centuries.
Indeed. It's a journey that begins with a single, terrifying choice made on the coast of France.
Exactly. We're talking about faith, about profound loss, but also about just monumental courage, the kind needed to uproot your entire life.
That courage is really our anchor today. We're diving into the early history of the DuBose family in America. We're going to focus on the patriarch, Isaac DuBose.
Isaac DuBose. Okay.
And to really get this, you have to grapple with this foundational question. What kind of conviction, what deep, unshakable belief does it take to just surrender everything? Your home, your history, language, community,
Everything familiar.
everything, all for a future you can barely imagine, based purely on the promise of being able to practice your faith freely.
That single choice really did redefine their whole destiny. So Isaac DuBose, born around 1660 in Dieppe, that's D-E-E in France, his life and the life of his wife Suzanne and all their descendants, it becomes tied to this massive upheaval, this migration.
It really does.
But before we get into the persecution itself, maybe we should touch on their name, the identity that traveled with them.
Yes, that's a crucial detail, actually, because the name we know today, DuBose, and we'll probably stick with that for clarity, well, it wasn't quite fixed back then when they first crossed the Atlantic.
Ah, okay, so it was more fluid.
Exactly.
Mm.
If you look at those early records, say, from the 1690s, things like land grants, naturalization petitions, you often see it spelled phonetically, like how an English clerk might hear it.
Right, just writing down the sound.
So you get Dubosc, D-U-B-O-S-C, pronounced Dubosc back in France.
DuBose. So you can almost hear the clerk writing down what he thinks he heard. And that change, from boss to Bose or even Bois,
Yeah.
that must have started happening pretty quickly in Carolina.
Almost instantly, yes.
Mhm.
It really highlights how they were adapting, integrating. And that initial phonetic spelling, that's why you find these different branches today, all tracing back to the same root.
Like Dubois.
Dubois, even Dubusque sometimes. They all trace back to that same family, that same arrival. So the name itself is kind of a living record of their journey, their linguistic shift, their assimilation into this new English-speaking culture.
That's fascinating. A family's history literally coded into how their name evolved. Okay, so let's transition now. To understand why they had to escape, we need to understand the world they were forced to leave behind. What was life like for Isaac DuBose in Dieppe before? Well, before the fear took over.
Right. You have to picture Dieppe. It's in Normandy, right there on the coast.
Yeah.
And this wasn't some quiet little village.
No.
No, by the mid-17th century, Dieppe was a really cosmopolitan place, a bustling, prosperous port city. Imagine the harbor. It would have been just a forest of ship masts, lots of trade, wealth coming in and going out, real commercial energy.
And a significant part of that energy, that prosperity, it came from the French Protestants, the Huguenots.
Absolutely crucial. The Huguenots weren't some marginal group. In many areas, they were the economic engine. Highly skilled artisans, goldsmiths, silk weavers, clockmakers, jewelers, and also very successful merchants. They controlled significant chunks of French shipping manufacturing.
So Isaac grew up in a community that was strong, established, contributing significantly to France.
Definitely. His community was stable, respected, and importantly, legally protected, at least for a while.
Which brings us to the Edict of Nantes. This was the big royal decree that protected them for almost a century. What was the core promise of that edict?
Well, fundamentally, the Edict of Nantes was their shield. It guaranteed Huguenots the right to practice their Protestant faith publicly and safely. It even designated specific fortified towns for them and allowed them to establish their own schools and universities. It meant they weren't just tolerated, they were legally recognized citizens with rights.
A shield. That's a good way to put it. But by the time Isaac is reaching adulthood, France has a new king on the throne, Louis XIV, the Sun King.
Yes, and Louis XIV had a very different vision for France. He saw this religious division not as diversity, but as a kind of stain, a flaw in the perfect unity of his kingdom.
He wanted absolute uniformity.
Precisely. Louis was deeply religious himself, a devout Catholic, and he genuinely believed that for France to reach its divine potential, it had to have one king, one law, and one faith. His faith. Protestantism, to him, was an affront, both theologically and politically. His goal wasn't coexistence, it was eradication.
So if the edict was the shield, the 1680s became the decade where Louis XIV started systematically dismantling it. How did this gathering storm, as you call it, start to impact everyday life for someone like Isaac and Dieppe?
It began subtly, almost bureaucratically, a kind of slow strangulation through policy. The first moves were often economic.
How's it?
Huguenots started being systematically banned from certain professions, particularly things like law, medicine, positions in government, printing, roles that carried influence or were particularly lucrative.
So even if you were the best doctor or the most successful merchant, your faith could suddenly disqualify you.
Exactly. It was about removing them from positions of power and, frankly, making it harder to earn a good living. But it went beyond just jobs.
Their schools were targeted too.
Yes, Protestant schools were ordered closed. The aim was clear: ensure the next generation had no option but Catholic education. You see, this wasn't just random persecution. It was a calculated state strategy. Make Protestantism financially difficult, culturally isolated, and ultimately unsustainable.
And then came the attacks on the physical symbols of their faith, their churches, which they called temples.
That must have been incredibly demoralizing. Imagine watching the building that was the center of your spiritual life, your community life, where you were baptized, married, where you gathered every week, being ordered demolished, sometimes literally stone by royal decree.
It's sending a very clear message.
An existential one. It screams, your identity here is temporary. You are unwanted. This steady escalation of pressure, it built the tension to a breaking point, and it paved the way for the most brutal tactic of all, the dragonades.
Right, the dragonades. This is where the state's pressure becomes outright terror. What exactly were they?
It sounds almost mundane at first, military quartering. But the cruelty was in the specifics. The king's soldiers, his dragoons, these were often intimidating cavalrymen, weren't just sent to garrison the town. They were specifically ordered to be billeted or forcibly quartered, only in Huguenot homes.
So non-Huguenot neighbors were exempt, but Huguenot families had soldiers forced upon them.
Correct. And these weren't just polite house guests.
Yeah.
The soldiers were given, well, let's just say explicit unofficial permission, wink wink, nudge nudge, to make life utterly unbearable for their hosts.
What did that look like in practice?
Historical accounts are just chilling. Soldiers would deliberately destroy furniture, smash family heirlooms, stable their horses inside the house, practice shooting drills indoors, sell off the family's livestock for drinking money. They'd make noise constantly, day and night, to prevent sleep. It was systematic torment.
Pure psychological torture designed for one purpose.
Conversion. Immediate conversion. The goal was to make daily existence so miserable, so ruinous, that the head of the household would break down and sign a document converting the entire family to Catholicism.
And if they signed?
The dragoons left immediately. The message was crystal clear. Convert and the torment stops. Refuse, and it continues indefinitely. It was incredibly effective, forcing thousands upon thousands to convert under duress.
This relentless pressure, this state-sponsored terror, it all leads up to the final blow in October 1685. King Louis XIV formally revokes the Edict of Nantes.
Yes, the shield wasn't just chipped away anymore. It was completely shattered. Protestantism became illegal overnight, and the law that followed, the Edict of Fontainebleau, created what historians rightly call a cruel trap.
A cruel trap. How so? What did the law actually say?
It was cleverly designed, depending on who you were. For Protestant pastors, the spiritual leaders, they were given just 2 weeks. Convert to Catholicism or leave France immediately. Exile. Louis wanted the leadership either assimilated or gone.
Okay, get rid of the shepherds, but what about the flock? The ordinary Huguenots like Isaac, the artisans, the merchants, the farmers.
For them, the law was a vice grip. They were strictly forbidden to leave France, under any circumstances.
Wait, so he makes their religion illegal. He terrorizes them, but he won't let them leave. Why? Was it purely about keeping their skills and labor?
It was largely economic, yes. Despite his religious fervor, Louis XIV wasn't stupid. He knew that letting 500,000 or more of his most productive, skilled citizens simply walk away would be an economic disaster for France. He wanted their labor, their taxes, their skills. But he demanded they renounce their faith.
So Isaac's choice became stark. Stay and face forced conversion, likely preceded by more dragonades, or become an outlaw by trying to flee.
Precisely. And fleeing wasn't just illegal. The penalty for being caught was terrifying.
What happened if you were caught trying to escape?
For men, the most common sentence was condemnation to the galleys for life. Women often faced imprisonment, sometimes in horrific conditions, or confinement in convents. Families could be ruined, their property confiscated.
Condemned to the galleys. We hear that phrase, but we need to understand what it meant. It was called a living death. What was the reality?
It's hard to overstate the horror. You were literally chained, usually by the ankle, to a bench on one of the king's warships, the galleys. Chained 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often for years, until you died.
Chained to the oar.
Chained to the bench, forced to row the massive oars in unison with the dozens of other condemned men. Exposed to scorching sun, freezing storms, the constant crack of the overseer's whip if your rhythm faltered. You slept where you sat, ate minimal rations, often rowing naked in the heat, surrounded by filth and disease.
How long could someone survive that?
Life expectancy was incredibly short. A few years, often. Exhaustion, exposure, malnutrition, beatings, disease. It was designed to break you physically and spiritually before it killed you. It was considered by many a fate worse than execution because it was prolonged public agony. A complete obliteration of dignity.
Knowing that was the potential price, it just underscores the desperation, the conviction Isaac must have felt. The choice. Abandon your faith or risk that to abandon your country.
It's almost unimaginable. Yet hundreds of thousands felt they had no other real choice. They chose the immense risk of escape over the certainty of spiritual death, as they saw it.
And we know Isaac DuBose made that choice. He got out. But the details of how he escaped Dieppe, those are lost, aren't they?
They are. We don't have Isaac's personal account, which isn't surprising. Successful escapes depended on secrecy, on silence. Leaving a written record would have been incredibly dangerous, potentially exposing routes or helpers. So, like with many refugees, the specifics of his journey, the exact route, the date who helped him, are gone.
So how do we understand the danger he faced?
We rely on the documented accounts of other Huguenot refugees who did leave records, or whose stories were recorded later. These paint a vivid picture of the kind of perils Isaac would have almost certainly encountered.
Okay, so starting from a major port like Dieppe, which would have been heavily watched, how would someone even begin to get out? What were the methods?
For coastal escapes like from Dieppe, the most common route involved smugglers. There were clandestine networks, often run by sailors, fishermen, sometimes even sympathetic foreign ship captains, who specialized in moving human cargo. But it was incredibly risky.
Risky how? Beyond just being caught by officials.
Well, first, it cost a fortune. Smugglers demanded exorbitant fees, often bankrupting families. You had to have cash, and a lot of it. Second, the risk of betrayal was constant. A smuggler could easily take your money and then turn you over to the authorities for a reward, saving their own skin. You were putting your life in the hands of often unscrupulous people.
Assuming you found someone trustworthy and paid them, where would they actually hide people on a ship leaving a French port?
Disguise was usually too dangerous. So, concealment. We have accounts of people being hidden in the most horrendous places, crammed into large, empty wine casks or flour barrels with just tiny air holes drilled in.
Oh my God. For how long?
Sometimes for days, until the ship was well out to sea. Others were hidden in specially built false bottoms below deck, or literally buried under piles of legitimate cargo timber, coal, fishing nets, in complete darkness, suffocating air, unable to move or make a sound.
The mental image, trapped in a barrel, in the dark, hearing guards maybe walking on the deck above, knowing one cough, one stumble, one baby's cry.
Exactly. That was the ultimate terror, especially for families with young children. There are heartbreaking accounts of parents having to make impossible decisions like using sedatives or opiates to keep infants quiet, knowing a single sound could doom everyone on board, leading them all to the galleys or prison.
The fact that Isaac and presumably his future wife, Suzanne Couillondeau, that's Couillon-DOH, right?
Yes, Suzanne Couillondeau, also a Huguenot refugee.
The fact that they made it through that speaks volumes about their planning, their resilience, and maybe just sheer luck, too.
Absolutely. Luck played a huge part. But somehow, they navigated that gauntlet and reached England. They made it to London.
London must have felt like stepping into another world. Safety, at last. But you mentioned it was only a temporary haven for many, including Isaac. Why not just stay in England?
London certainly offered immediate relief. It was a Protestant center, and the English churches, particularly the French Huguenot churches already established there, mounted massive relief efforts. They provided food, shelter, support for the tens of thousands of refugees flooding in. But London was also becoming extremely overcrowded. Jobs were scarce, especially skilled ones competing with native Londoners. And crucially, the opportunity for refugees to acquire land, to become truly independent and self-sufficient, was limited in England itself.
So he'd escaped the immediate danger, but he was still fundamentally a refugee, likely dependent on charity in a crowded, expensive city.
Precisely. And for many Huguenots, including Isaac, the goal wasn't just safety. It was the chance to rebuild their lives completely, to become independent landowners, to practice their faith without any hindrance. And that meant looking further west, across the Atlantic.
To the New World. So the drive shifts from escape to opportunity. The promise was land And that absolute religious freedom he'd risked everything for. And the timing was right, you mentioned, because of the new English colony of Carolina.
Perfect timing in a way. The Lords Proprietors, this group of 8 powerful English noblemen who had been granted the charter for Carolina by King Charles II. They were actively, almost desperately seeking settlers.
Why were they so keen on settlers? Just to fill the land?
Well, yes, but they weren't just looking for anybody. They specifically recruited Huguenots.
Really? Why were Huguenots seen as particularly desirable for a place like Carolina?
They brought several key advantages from the proprietor's perspective. First, their reputation. Huguenots were known across Europe for their sobriety, their incredible work ethic, their resilience. They weren't afraid of hard work.
Okay, so reliable colonists.
Exactly. Second, they were skilled. Many possessed valuable trades, viniculture, winemaking, silk production, various artisan crafts skills the proprietors hoped would diversify Carolina's economy beyond just basic agriculture. Third, and this was politically very important,
Yes.
they were fervently anti-French and anti-Catholic. In a region where England was competing with Spanish Florida to the south and French Louisiana to the west, having staunchly Protestant settlers was seen as a strategic advantage. They were a reliable buffer.
So for Isaac and Suzanne, this wasn't just finding refuge, it was an invitation to become founders, to build something new.
That's exactly the transition, from refugee to founder. It was an incredible opportunity to gain land, autonomy, and secure that religious freedom permanently. Yeah. But there was still one more immense hurdle.
The Atlantic crossing itself. It's easy to just say they sailed to America, but this wasn't a cruise.
No, we really have to pause here because this voyage was the second great trial after the escape from France. It typically took 2 to 3 months, sometimes even longer if the winds were bad.
And the conditions on board.
Appalling, usually. These weren't passenger ships in the modern sense. They were often converted merchant vessels, cargo ships. People were crammed below deck in dark, airless, unsanitary conditions. Imagine hundreds of people sharing cramped spaces for months on end.
Disease must have been rampant.
Oh, absolutely. Typhus, ship fever, dysentery, scurvy. These diseases swept through the packed quarters. Ventilation was poor, sanitation was rudimentary at best, food and water supplies could run low or spoil. Mortality rates on these voyages could be tragically high.
So you survive the persecution, you survive the secret escape, and now you face potentially fatal disease and misery for months at sea.
It truly tested the limits of human endurance. You're already weakened physically and emotionally from everything you've been through, and now you face this. It demanded incredible fortitude just to survive the journey.
But Isaac and Suzanne did survive. They arrived in Charlestown, the early name for Charleston, sometime between, say, 1687 and 1689. What would they have found there? What was their first impression?
Well, if they were picturing anything like Dieppe, with its established harbor and stone buildings, or even the dense brick city of London, they were in for a shock.
How so?
Charlestown then was raw. It was a new, somewhat chaotic subtropical outpost struggling to establish itself. Think humidity, wooden structures, sandy streets, unfamiliar smells and sounds, the constant backdrop of the surrounding wilderness. It was very much a frontier settlement, not a grand European city.
And they didn't linger in Charlestown itself for long, did they? The deal was land, and they were sent upriver.
That's right. They, along with other Huguenot groups, were granted land along the Santee River, which is about 40 miles or so north of Charlestown as the crow flies. This was pushing them into the interior, into the real frontier.
Why the Santee? Was the land particularly good there?
It was very fertile land, yes, suitable for the kind of agriculture the proprietors envisioned. But it was also strategically important to establish settlements further inland, creating a buffer zone and encouraging development beyond the immediate coast. But it meant moving from the temperate maritime climate of Normandy to a humid subtropical world.
A whole new set of challenges. What were they facing in that Santee River environment?
Oh, immense challenges. Firstly, the climate itself, the intense heat and humidity, which they were completely unused to.
Yeah.
Then the environment, dense forests, swamps, unfamiliar flora and fauna. They had to learn an entirely new ecology.
And new dangers, too, presumably.
Absolutely. Unfamiliar diseases were a huge threat. Malaria, yellow fever carried by mosquitoes bred in the swampy terrain devastated early European settlers who had no immunity. There was also the wildlife and the crucial back-breaking labor of clearing the land. This wasn't neat French farmland. This was thick, often swampy wilderness that had to be tamed before it could be planted.
It sounds incredibly daunting. But we have that one specific wonderful detail from a historical source, a letter written by another settler around 1688. Tell us about that small house of 25 feet.
Yes, that letter really brings their initial reality into sharp focus. This fellow Huguenot settler wrote about being content, finding satisfaction with a small house of 25 feet built out of wood in the Carolina fashion.
25 feet, that's tiny, like a small room. And Carolina fashion, what does that suggest about the construction?
It implies a practical, quick-build approach, using the most readily available local material. Height timber. These were likely simple frame houses, possibly built on posts to raise them slightly off the damp ground, maybe with a wide porch or piazza to help manage the heat. Definitely not the sturdy stone or half-timbered houses they knew in France. It was about shelter, survival, pragmatism. Rough, immediate.
So Isaac and Suzanne weren't just building a house, they were literally building a new life from the ground up, learning to survive in this incredibly fertile but also quite dangerous new land.
And crucially, they weren't doing it in isolation. Their survival, their success, it really depended on the strength of their community. They were settled alongside other Huguenot families they likely knew from France or London, names like Ravenel, Gaillard, Jalelyard, Mazic, Porcher.
So that shared experience, the persecution, the escape, the voyage, now facing this frontier together, it must have forged incredibly strong bonds.
Absolutely. It created a tight-knit, highly resilient collective. They supported each other, shared knowledge, intermarried. This community network was vital for overcoming the immense challenges of settlement.
And at the very center of that community, surely, was the faith they had risked everything to preserve.
It was the absolute core. One of the very first things they did was establish their own French Protestant church there on the Santee in a settlement they called French Jamestown. That church wasn't just for Sunday worship. It was the social hub, the cultural anchor, the place where their French language and identity were maintained, at least initially. It was the center of their universe in this new world.
So, it's here, on the banks of the Santee, that the American branch of the DuBose family truly begins. Isaac and Suzanne start their family. Children are born Isaac II, Daniel, Stephen, John, others. How did their experience, their identity, differ fundamentally from their parents?
That's the pivotal generational shift, isn't it? Isaac and Suzanne carried the memory of France, the trauma of persecution, the difficult journey. They were French refugees who became Carolina settlers. But their children.
They grew up there.
Exactly.
Okay.
They grew up knowing the Santee River, the Carolina landscape, the English language alongside French. They didn't have personal memories of the Dragonades or the escape. Their foundational experiences were tied to this new land, this frontier society. They weren't Frenchmen living abroad. They were Carolinians.
Their anchor had shifted from the old world to the new.
Completely. While their parents might have always felt a connection back to France, the children's identity was forged in America. They were assimilating, interacting with English settlers, becoming part of the fabric of the colony.
And this process, this shift in identity, it culminates in a formal legal step in 1696. Naturalization. Why was this so important?
Naturalization was the final seal on their belonging. Isaac and Suzanne, along with many other Huguenots in the Santee settlement, petitioned the colonial government to be formally recognized as English subjects.
What did that grant them, practically?
It granted them full civil rights under English law, the undisputed right to own land, to inherit property, to pass it on to their children, the right to participate in colonial governance, to serve on juries. It confirmed they weren't just tolerated guests or resident aliens anymore. They were officially part of their new home, legally indistinguishable from settlers born in England.
No longer refugees who could theoretically be asked to leave, they were citizens.
Exactly. Stakeholders in the future of Carolina. It was a hugely significant moment securing their permanence and the future of their families in America.
So when Isaac DuBose passed away in 1714, he lived in South Carolina for more than a quarter of a century. Looking back at his life, from Dieppe to the Santee, what's the legacy he leaves?
I think his life stands as a testament to just quiet, profound courage and deep, unwavering faith. His legacy is really defined by overcoming those three immense hurdles we've talked about.
Surviving the persecution.
Yes, surviving the systematic tyranny of Louis XIV's France. Second, enduring the incredibly perilous journey, the secret escape, the brutal Atlantic crossing. And third, succeeding in the monumental back-breaking task of transplanting his family, planting new roots in a challenging, unfamiliar land, and making them thrive.
He literally risked that living death in the galleys, not just for himself, but for the promise of a future his children and grandchildren could inherit. A future where they wouldn't face that impossible choice between faith and country.
That's the inheritance. An inheritance of freedom bought at tremendous personal risk. He was a man who risked everything, perhaps not for personal glory, but for the security and liberty of his descendants.
It's an incredible founding story, and as you said, it all begins there, Isaac and Suzanne, on the banks of the Santee River. That's where the American story of this family starts.
It is, and it raises an interesting point connecting back to today. We've pieced this together using historical records, land grants, petitions, church registers, letters, the traditional tools of the historian.
Right, following the paper trail.
But what's fascinating now is how modern science is increasingly able to corroborate and even expand on these histories. Genealogy, combined with DNA analysis?
Ah, so genetics is now helping to prove these connections traced through old documents.
Precisely. Advanced DNA testing and sophisticated genealogical databases are allowing descendants today to physically verify the branches of family trees like the DuBose line, tracing them back across centuries and continents. It's providing scientific confirmation of the heritage forged by the courage of individuals like Isaac.
So the story isn't just in the archives, it's literally carried in the genes. That's a powerful link between past courage and present identity.
It really is. It connects people living today directly back to that desperate choice made in Dieppe, that arduous journey, and that hopeful beginning on the Santee River over 300 years ago.
A remarkable journey indeed. Thank you so much for taking us through this deep dive into Isaac DuBose's incredible story.
It was my pleasure. A truly compelling piece of history.
Join us next time as we continue to explore what happened next, how Isaac's descendants navigated the challenges and opportunities of colonial America, forging their own chapter in the American story.